Tom Robbins was a journalist who could not abide injustice or the deliberate deceit of corruption and greed. He died on May 28th. In addition to being a Pulitzer Prize finalist, he was a winner of the Hillman Prize for Newspaper Journalism, a mentor and educator at Hunter College, and at CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, as well as the host of Deadline NYC on WBAI. But it's his generosity of spirit that touched me the most. I remember when he donated one of his kidneys to a friend in need, when he quit working at the Village Voice because they fired his friend and associate, Wayne Barrett, when he often visited Joe Gordon in prison, and an Innocence Project client, 80 years old, in prison for 32 years, denied parole 8 times for the lack of remorse. He wrote about him in the New York Times, and Joe died just before Tom, still incarcerated. I talked with Tom not so long ago about his work as a community organizer and his long career as a reporter and journalist. And we replay that conversation today in his honor.
I'm so glad to be here, Ronnie. Okay. Thanks for having me.
An investigative reporter spends how long on a question that they're investigating?
Maybe anywhere from a week to a year.
Yeah. And where do you go? All over?
Well, I'm a local guy, Ronnie, so I don't usually get west of the Hudson River or south of Staten Island, right. But I roam the city.
And do you get any information from online?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So how do you cope with so much stuff that isn't true?
That isn't true.
Right.
I tune it out,
Are you able to decipher what is right and what isn't?
I think you get a pretty good built-in sense as to, something that has not been properly vetted. I tell you, it's something I talk to my students about a lot, is like how to sort of use, your judgment and be careful, particularly when, you're being directed to some website you never heard of and somebody's laying out a set of facts that sound, that's new, you really got to, kind of triangulate and find at least 1 or 2 other sources that are saying something similar.
Before we go any further, a journalist, what's the difference between a journalist and a reporter?
I'm a reporter. They call me a journalist. I don't know why. It's a school of journalism.
It's
so they
grandiosity,
call me
right?
Yeah, basically.
I think that's what, I think that's
I'm a reporter. But I tell people I'm a reporter, and they say, well, who do you report for? And I say, well, these days I kind of report for myself, because I do a lot of freelance work for the Times and the New Yorker.
And you're all over the place with your articles.
I've been all over the place the last few years, right? Since I left The Voice in 2011.
Is it exciting to meet all these new young wannabe journalists?
Some of them are pretty exciting. Some of them are a pain in the neck, but some of them are very exciting. Yeah. No, I met with a young woman yesterday who's got exactly the right questions to ask that she's looking at, and just starting out, and I can just tell she's got the chops. Yeah. She's going to make it happen.
And what makes them, you think, pick? I'm trying to get some of my grandchildren to consider going to.
Oh, be careful what you ask for there, Ronnie.
Right, I should know that. Yeah. But it seems to me it's such a putting together of all the different kinds of people in the world that we're going to rely on for some information or interpretations or something. And it's covering all this media. It's not just theater, film, and community stuff.
Yes, podcasts.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's all these new techniques. Listen, I think the reason people are still drawn to it is because they recognize that it can be the greatest job in the world. You get paid to talk to people and to ask questions, and you have a license to ask questions. You're curious about something, you take out your notebook and your pencil, and you just say, hey, I want to ask you about something you just said or what you're doing or something. It gives you kind of a passport to almost any place that you want to go. And, you get, used to having doors slammed in your face, which does happen every now and again, and sometimes too often, or people hang up on you. It can really turn into an incredibly rewarding job.
And do you remember stuff? That's very important too, isn't it?
I certainly remember the things that I think that have resonated with me over the years. There are certain names of landlords from the 1980s I will never get out of my head, no matter how obscure they were.
It's so
politicians,
interesting.
from, East Brooklyn, these names stick with you. Not everything.
You started out as a community organizer?
I did, yes. Yeah, thanks for remembering. That's
Yeah.
right, on the Lower East Side in the 70s. And I was working during the time of arson and landlord abandonment. And I said, this is just stuff that's got to be written about because it is destroying New York. I said, how do I do this? And I had a friend who worked for a newspaper, and he said, basically, start typing. We'll get something in.
So what was the first newspaper?
I worked for a trio of local papers in Brooklyn,
Ah.
North Brooklyn, one in Brighton Beach, covering local crime, courts, education, Williamsburg, I covered the Hasidic takeover of a local school board, something I could not understand then or now since none of their kids went to the public schools.
Yeah.
But it was a great lesson in terms of how the city works. And then I went to work for City Limits Magazine for 5 years.
were the
And that
editor.
was a great
Right.
training ground.
How old was that? Was that just started?
It had been going for a couple of years at that point. But
Yeah.
it was-
And
it
when
was,
did you go to The Voice?
About 5 years later. And I stayed there. I did 2 tours there. I did a tour in the 80s. And then I left with Jack Newfield, right? We went to the Daily News together.
You didn't leave in protest.
Not that time.
You left the news. You left the news though in protest.
No,
Didn't you?
I left The Voice the second time when Wayne Barrett got fired in 2000.
I remember that
10.
day because you came to see my husband,
Did I?
who was in the hospital.
Did I? Yeah.
Yeah,
See,
you and
asked me,
Wayne.
do I remember
You and
everything?
Wayne both came.
Oh, that's right. That's right. We're going to go see Jimmy. That's right. I remember now. That's right.
That combination of you.
I think he was mad at us.
Oh,
Said, "You did
why
what?"
not? But you and Wayne and Jack Newfield, I mean, that was quite a crew.
Yeah, well,
Fun.
we had a lot of fun together, and we had sort of an unorthodox approach to the news. We weren't on a daily newspaper, so we didn't have to race to catch up every single day. We were on a weekly, and we had the time to be able to sort of dig in and sort of get the story behind the story and come up with stuff when the daily press has sort of stopped looking that says, hey, wait a minute, this is the other side of this story. It's pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
And why did you leave the news? What was that protest?
The Daily News was owned by a real estate developer at the time, and
That was Mort.
his name was Mort Zuckerman. I don't mind saying it, and and he had a relationship with the governor and a relationship with the mayor, and we were always sort of backed off sometimes on stories, and I just felt like what's the point, right? I mean, it's not I could find some other place where I could just write what I want. So I went back to The Voice. That was in 2000. And I was there for the next dozen years.
I just looked at some old articles. They were really great. So what motivates you? I mean, it is really a question of keeping things true in a funny way. It's corruption because that's taking advantage and distorting what people's expectations of good government or good management or something, right? And then the other thing seems to be injustice. Am I wrong?
No, I think those are probably the 2 core issues. I don't say them out loud to myself. I'm not sure journalists do either, but
Yeah.
But yeah, if you feel like there is either a political leader or a corporate official or someone who seems to be taking advantage of people or the situation, and no one seems to be shining a spotlight on them, you sort of feel, hey, I'm just the guy for the job, and you start digging into it and try to find the story. In terms of justice, you and I have talked a lot about this in the last few years. I've done a lot of stories about criminal justice and about people locked up behind bars who deserve to get out, and some people who do get out, some people who can't get out. And I have found that to be, a very both exhausting as well as sometimes exhilarating subject to write about. I've met some of the best people I know behind bars in the last 10 or 12 years. It's really interesting.
Right. It's very compelling. It's something that I don't know how I ever got involved in it, but once I got involved in it, I was just so absorbed by it and by what it means. It's how people look at crime, or not even crime, how people look at who they think are perpetrators of crime. Is that right? I've said this over and over, but when I used to visit the women at Bedford Hills, I always felt, it's an old expression, there but for the grace of God goes I.
Right.
Because so many people are there for something that just happened that you didn't plan and you didn't expect. And once that happens, the road that you're on is endless. It just
Changes forever, and there's no
yeah.
way out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that our mutual friend Judy Clark would say to me when she was at Bedford Hills, that most people are here because of something that happened in about 45 seconds of their lives.
Yeah, exactly.
Some crazy, stupid thing that they were either involved in or that they did, and then there was no turning back from that. And they were never allowed to fix that time in their life.
Right. It's too difficult. Nobody wants to hear it. And in these days, I think when the use of fear is so much, am I exaggerating that people are, talking fear more, are trying to make people more fearful than ever? Some people.
Well, we certainly saw it in the last gubernatorial
Yeah.
election. Goodness gracious.
Right.
That fellow Zeldin, who almost won, bizarrely
Right.
enough, he really was stoking the fear factor, getting everybody terrified
Right.
of living in New York. I mean, look, there have been some terrible crimes committed in this city in the last couple of years, no question about it. But the incidence of crime, still, I got on the train, I came here, it was a perfectly safe trip. That happens, 99 out of 100 times. It shouldn't happen that 100th time, but it's not something that governs everything about your life and about your political leaders and the policies you lead. Now, that was a pretty strange moment, driven by the New York Post, I would say. Murdoch just turned over the Post every single front page for like 2 months straight about this criminal and that criminal and putting it all on Governor Hochul. It was really interesting to watch them do that.
It was terrible. It reminded me, when I read the paper today about legislation to ensure that Chinese people can't buy property in Texas. I don't know why, but it reminded me.
It makes you laugh, no matter how outrageous
Yeah, it's
it is.
incredible. But how the owner of the Post
Rupert Murdoch, yes.
became an American citizen,
Right, yes, right.
in order to
Right.
protect whatever he was going to do. Was it a television station? Is that what caused it?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So then he comes, and what he does to the public is just incredible.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether, I've had a lot of friends work at the Post over the years and some now, and I sometimes wonder, New York might be a lot better off without this paper. I mean, there's a lot of good reporting in it. There's still good stories. They cover things that other people aren't doing, but their primary role seems to be to try to gin up fear, and I find that to be so offensive that they keep doing
Are
it.
you old enough to have been reading the Post when Dorothy Schiff was the
Oh,
publisher?
yeah, sure. The Post, Murdoch didn't get it till, 76 or 77, I think, right before the
Yeah,
first
but there are a few
Koch
couple of
election.
people in between.
Between Schiff and
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
Well, James Wexler was still writing a column.
Yeah.
They still had Murray Kempton wrote a
Right.
column there for a long
Right.
time. It was a very different paper.
Yeah, totally. Anyway, so let's go back to criminal justice.
Okay.
Not only were friends of Judy Clark's and trying to help get her out, which involves all kinds of political maneuvering and organizing and everything. It's fascinating. It's like a political campaign. You've got
It
people.
was very much like that.
Yeah, you've got people who try to interest somebody writing in the press, and you've got other people who are at the extreme and demonstrating,
Right.
and then you've got people who are inside trying to maneuver.
Right.
It's very interesting.
Yes, and you think
a
about
big
how
strategy.
labor intensive it is for every single case.
Yeah.
We did an event that I helped organize at the Newmark Journalism School in early December with a lot of people who had received clemency. And we had a panel of people. Judy Clark was on it. Elaine Lord, the former warden at Bedford Hills, was on it. And the idea was that we would hope that we would sort of raise the profile. And we had, people talk about their experience both in and out. With that, it would make it more politically acceptable for people like Governor Hochul to say, okay, I can do what needs to be done.
But she didn't get the message, I don't think, at the time.
Well, not this time. Not this
She
time.
hasn't been anxious to do it, and the expectation was that she might do it. She might be.
Yeah. Well, you know, Andrew Cuomo didn't do any for his first, I forget, 3 or 4 years in office. You know,
And it took a lot of work.
and it took a lot of work to get him to finally move off the dime. But like, look, every governor who fears, and she's got more reason to fear now than ever about being voted out of office,
That's
is
right.
reluctant. Why should I risk my job for somebody who committed a crime?
Right. But you and I also know another person who's been in for how many years? 27, 28
Are we
years?
talking about Joe Gordon?
Yeah.
We do indeed, yeah.
Yeah, 28.
I think it's 30. I think he's in 30 years now at this point. Yes. Joe Gordon, who is now 80,
79,
78,
I think. Yeah.
79. He's been in and out of the hospital for the last year. I wrote about him for the New York Times a year ago last December. And he had already been turned down for parole at that point, I think
several
4 or
times.
5 times. And I thought, well, the next time he's up after they read this article, they'll have to let him out.
Yeah.
And I was very naive
Right.
because his next hearing, just a few weeks later, they shut him down.
And what's
And he's been
interesting,
shut down again since then, and he's been
Yeah.
very ill.
he's been in and out of the hospital outside of
Right.
the jail. He's had recommendations from all kinds of, from the superintendent at Fishkill, where he is now, and
A
everything.
rare letter from the superintendent
Yeah.
saying this is the most eligible guy to be free
Right.
that I know.
And he was married while he was in prison, and he has a very good place to go if he gets out.
Yes, I met his wife and his family. They're
Yeah.
looking forward to getting him.
And he's a client, is that what you would call it, of the Innocence Project?
Right. Nina Morrison is now on the federal bench, was his attorney. She said he was her longest client. She stuck to his case for, I think, 17 years.
So the reason he's their client is that he says he's innocent.
Right.
And when he goes before the parole board, they say he doesn't express enough remorse.
And
Now,
every
how
single
ridiculous is that?
Every single hearing, they read the sentencing minutes from the judge, which were, you know, kind of thing you never deserve to walk free again in this society. You know, look, we thought we were making some headway, I think, in terms of new appointments on the parole board, but I think it's sort of fallen back a lot into what it was, where they sometimes to say you didn't do it is to not express remorse for the crime, so therefore you don't deserve to go out, and that's the interpretation they make.
So let's talk about the parole board, because that's a board and the role of victims. And I have to confess that I can't guarantee that, God forbid, I should be on the victim side, how I would be. But I think that in a funny way, unless it's been subject to restorative justice, the victims have exceedingly a lot of power. And their role, they're given that role. I mean, they can go to sentencing when a person, after you've been convicted, they can go to the parole board. I don't understand.
I'm not sure that there's a logical explanation that we can say the basic one is that parole boards serve at the pleasure of the governor, and that they all live in fear of letting loose somebody who is then going to turn around and commit another crime. Right. And then the next thing you know, the New York Post, our friend that we were just talking about, will have their picture in the paper and talk about the parole board members who were soft on crime, and they'll never get reappointed. So I think that lurks in the back of their head every time a case comes before them. Will this person be safe outside?
Yeah, but they have to get away from their own personal fears in a way. They're like Republicans who are afraid they may lose their job if
Right.
It's time when you play a public role of some kind.
Yeah.
A sense of personal integrity.
Yeah, and the sentences are still so draconian. You know, we still, and people are aging, but in New York State prison, I forget what the percentage is, but like over 2/3 of people are like north of 65 years old, and they've served over 20 years in prison.
And all the evidence shows that people who age are going to be much least
likely to reoffend.
Yeah.
Yeah. No one seems to argue that point. I mean, that seems to be almost settled science, practically. At rare occasions it happens, but they're the rare ones.
But then you realize how many different forces there are involved. I mean, there's the union.
Police
say
union.
That?
The police union militates against anybody who's involved in a crime that involves a police officer. They literally have a a list of everybody as to when they're coming up for a parole hearing to make sure that they tell that parole board hearing this person never deserves to walk free again. And they orchestrate a campaign, which is, it's interesting to look at. If you go to their websites, it requires minimal effort on anyone's part. You don't have to know anything about the case. You just have to click on a letter that then goes to the board, and then, you know, the board counts that as like another count, saying someone else doesn't want to let you out. So cases involving police officers are always the most difficult, always most difficult.
All right. It's quite depressing.
Well, I don't know. I would say this, so for what it's worth, the number of people getting out right now seems to have increased.
Good.
Overall.
It's the anger, and people are spiteful, too many of them. Why are they?
Well, I think one of the things I realized when I started reporting on prisons is simply that those high walls are not just to keep people in there, to keep the public out. You know, no one really gets to see what goes on in prison. It's almost a secret society in there, and it is often a society of fear. Not everyone, you know, you can have instances where you can have, I think, superintendents who understand the role of rehabilitation and try to shape things, but more often than not, it's something that people, once you're shipped away, you're out of sight and out of mind, and people have no connection to it. Once you start talking about someone went to prison, everyone has the same reaction. Oh, you must be a really bad person. And I started this conversation by saying I've met some of the best people I know in prison waiting rooms. There's no question about it. People change. People grow and change.
So now let's talk politics a little bit.
Sure.
Was there a degree that it was harder to work under different mayors?
Oh, yeah, sure.
What happened during Giuliani's tenure?
Well, I mean, look, Rudy at least liked to fight, you know. I mean, it was always, they would never give you any information. They would hit back every time you wrote a story and call your editors and refuse to talk to you. But it was kind of hand-to-hand combat, you know, with Rudy. But you would go to the press conferences and he would start shouting you down, you know. I mean, Bloomberg, who came after him, was a different kind of problem because he really wouldn't engage. You know, he was kind of above it all. You know,
Yeah.
He wasn't nearly as tight-fisted with information as the Giuliani administration was, but it was very difficult to write about many aspects of the Bloomberg administration because, you know, he was a media mogul. And there was, I think, such sympathy for him by, you know, we know that like the top 3 publishers in New York, my publisher at the Daily News, Mort Zuckerman, Rupert Murdoch, and Sulzberger at the Times, they all told him you should run for a 3rd term. We like, you know, we like the way the city's going, even though we had a law that said it's illegal, you know, but they overturned the law.
They can always change the law.
They
right?
changed the law, you know. So, I mean, that was, to me, that was a pretty stunning thing. If that had happened in a South American country, you would have called it what it was,
Right.
a coup. But they pulled it off.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But that's also how we look at power, or how we look at people that we think have power and that they really do have power. You know, I mean,
Yes.
it's 2 ways of looking at it, right?
Right.
There's some people who know how to pretend that they have the power.
Yes. And
But
they're pretty good at kind of the wizard behind the curtain,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
exercising it.
Yeah. Are you old enough to have been writing during the Dinkins administration?
Johnny, come on. That was in the 1980s. How old am I, child? Of course I did. Yes. No, I covered David Dinkins
Yeah.
as borough president and later as mayor for his 1 term.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Why did Dinkins lose?
I always thought that David Dinkins did not really figure out how he needed to assert himself, to be able to lay claim to the fact that even though crime was a huge problem and it had crested in his first year in office to over 2,000 homicides, it had gone down steadily in every serious crime level for the last 3 years of his administration because of heck, he and Peter Valone got together and they got state to put in money for more cops on the street. But that was so overtaken, the Crown Heights riot, you know, knocked that out. It became something he could never get out from under, but he never made the case for himself. He did a lot of things that he never, I don't think, projected to people. I think he had some of the best people we've ever seen in administrative offices under his administration, but I never saw him really blowing his own whistle in the way. He was kind of a shy and retiring guy in many ways.
And a person who was always so polite.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, and modesty is part of
Well, I
being.
think that resonated with people in some extent, but then people started looking at him and saying, this guy's not protecting us, which actually wasn't true.
Right.
And that was the point that he never managed to get across.
Right. So now, have you been teaching or writing about the current administration?
I haven't done any writing about this administration much. I'm certainly watching it and reading and thinking about it. I did a seminar recently about some of the shenanigans of his former chief of staff, this guy from Brooklyn, the former Democratic Party counsel, Frank Carone, you know, who sort of fascinated me because he was just an old line Paul. You know, he came out of the Thomas Jefferson Club, you know, in Canarsie, which had always been the repository. It was Meade Esposito's home club. And so the fact that he went into City Hall with this administration and was there, and you know, he was kind of a walking conflict of interest in many areas. You know, to me, that was a pretty interesting chapter. You know, it's Eric Adams is a fascinating guy. You know, he grew up in poverty. He's a black guy who comes from the streets. He was a cop, and yet there is something to me sort of insecure and careless about the way he has governed since he took office. Careless clearly with the people he associates with, some of these crazy investment guys and restaurant owners. And well, I don't mind that he's out all night, but I wonder, like, well, who has his ear? He doesn't seem to really have enough of a built-in sort of sense of like what he needs to worry about.
So we're gonna begin to get some work from you.
That'll probably shape up. I'll probably start taking a look.
We've come to an end of the program.
Good.
And so I thank you very much.
A pleasure.
And look forward to what investigations and reporting and your wisdom will bring us.
I don't know about wisdom, but I'll do my best. Ronnie,
Thank
it's so great to see you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me on.
Thank you.